Morning, everybody. Crappy Mondays, 5 minutes late as usual. Welcome to the news agenda with me, Fleet Street Fox. And today I'm joined by my fellow Mirror columnist, Darren Lewis. There he is. He is there. I was thinking for a moment. Darren.
I am there. Good morning. Good morning. Happy Monday. How are you doing?
Happy half terms. Now, this is the People's Pay-Per-View, so get into the comments, ask us your questions. We'll do our best to answer them for you. If you want to tell us what you're doing with your children for half term in order to occupy them while still working, that would be great because I'd love some tips. Those of you listening on podcast are just going to have to wonder how on earth we are going to pay for any of the stuff that's in the news today. So, what have we got for you? Well, the Mirror has splashed on a call from BBC presenter Victoria Derbyshire for all women to go and attend early breast screening invitations after figures showed that 46% of women aged 50 don't bother to attend that first appointment. Now, there's more on that in the paper, and we're going to be talking about scans and the importance of them later on as well. But first, I want to take us to page 9, where we are reporting on a major policy change from Keir Starmer about the war in Ukraine. And this is something that could very seriously affect that situation, indeed all of Europe going forward. Darren, can you take us through this a bit? What's the Prime Minister been saying?
Well, Lizzie Buchan's our political editor with the story, and she says that Sir Keir Starmer says he's prepared to send a peacekeeping force to Ukraine if there is a deal to end the war with Russia. Now, I'm saying Lizzie says it, everybody knows. He's written a piece for one of the newspapers today. And I think the positioning of the piece is quite significant because it's in a right-wing newspaper. He's quite keen to project strength in the right areas. I'll get back to that in a second. There is an update to this in the last hour. And of course, you can follow all of it for our viewers. You can follow all of this on the Mirror website, all the developments. But in the last hour, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, US Secretary of State, has touched down in Saudi Arabia for talks with over ending the war. And a Ukrainian delegation's also touched down there as well. Not Trump, not Putin. And again, I'll get back to that in a second as well. But with the story, there are lots of implications to Lizzie's piece, not least a concern that British troops could be put in danger if the Russian President Vladimir Putin's forces were to attack again. Suddenly we find ourselves at war. Also, what will the numbers be? When will it happen? The military experts are insistent that the British Army couldn't guarantee peace on its own, and the suggestion is that Sir Keir Starmer is out in Paris speaking to other European leaders, and he will say to them, you've got to do your bit too. But what if they decide they don't want to make that kind of commitment? Our forces, and the former head of our military, Lord Dannett's been speaking to the BBC, and he said yesterday that our military would need up to 40,000 troops for a mission like that, and that we haven't even got
40,000 across all three armed forces, I don't think.
Well, exactly. So it would only really happen with the right people with the right equipment and the right training. And Susie, you and I both know, and our viewers know, the British public most certainly did not vote for this country to be involved in yet another war. So there are lots of different strands to this, lots of different concerns to this. Sir Keir, listen, obviously, let's not kid ourselves. We're a Labour supporting platform and we want Labour to do well, but we have to call out our viewers and our readers' concerns when they arise. And there are lots of concerns around this.
Yeah. Okay, what do you think, everybody? Are you concerned about sending troops to Ukraine? This is not part of the conflict. This is something which Keir Starmer is suggesting would happen as a result of a peace deal. So it'd be there to maintain a peace, not to start having weapons fired at them, theoretically. Phil says, hello, Susie and Darren, expat in Aussie, love your work. I worry about my relatives there. Chin up. I don't know if your relatives are in the US or Ukraine, but if they're called Battersby, I'm going to think they're probably somewhere up north. Well, we think of you as well in Australia, with all those terrible Australians around you. Bob says, get Labour out and get Starmer out. So he doesn't seem very impressed. Now, every previous Prime Minister, indeed an awful lot of foreign leaders too, since 2022, when Ukraine was invaded, have refused to be drawn on whether they would ever commit troops to anything at any point. Understandably so, it was a bit of an absolute meat grinder of a front line. It's been pretty bad. And it was bound to up the ante with Vladimir Putin, because if you start getting NATO countries arming and going face to face with Russia, Russia then goes, well, I think you're about to invade, so I can now nuke you. That's part of the rules of engagement that Russia has for its nuclear weapons. But now Donald Trump has decided on appeasement, and there really isn't any other word for it. He's going to give Putin something to go away, which, if you haven't heard of Danegeld, or our lovely poem by Rudyard Kipling about how you can pay the Danegeld but you never get rid of the Dane, I suggest you go and Google it after the broadcast, of course, not during. This talk now has moved to peacekeeping forces. Leslie says, we've been here before. We may not have voted for it, but let's not forget just how much the Ukraine war has affected us. Maintaining peace is totally different to being involved in a war. I think Starmer's got this right. The talk has moved to peacekeeping forces, and there's the difference, isn't it, that Leslie really raises, Darren. A peacekeeping force, whether from a NATO country or not, is something Putin cannot object to in the same way. Because if he gets to end his war with some land or whatever he gets out of it, he cannot then object to the fact that there is a line, a demarcation somewhere, which presumably is not going to be on the same place that it was originally, beyond which, there's going to be someone going this far and no further.
Yeah, the problem is with this entire thing is that there are lots of mixed messages doing the rounds, because as you've been saying, the interpretation of what we've seen so far is very much appeasement. And yet the Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, the UK Health Secretary, he's been doing the rounds on TV this morning, justifying his position. He's been saying that Ukraine is a front line, not just for the country, but for the rest of Europe. And the entire issue is set against the backdrop of Donald Trump talking about reducing America's defense commitments in Europe. So I think our viewers are raising a lot of the concerns that we have around this. It has to be one thing or the other. Now, as far as Sir Keir Starmer is concerned, it sounds very much as though he's desperately trying to project strength and decisiveness. But as you say, it's rather naive to make a commitment, given that so many leaders, not just in this country, but around Europe, are very coy about whether or not they will commit their countries.
Well, hang on there, Darren, because they have been up to now. But I think a lot of this has come about because of some talks with Macron over the weekend. And France has been saying we need to now think about a peacekeeping force. And because Trump is pulling out of all this stuff, Trump is the opposite of he's being expansionist if you're Canada or Greenland, but he's being isolationist if you're Europe. Yes. They're saying basically Europe is now saying, the European leaders are saying, we're going to have to do this ourselves. You, me, 10,000 from you, 40,000 from you, 20,000 together, we're going to have to go and do this ourselves. And it now sounds like, because it's not war they're talking about, it's peace, that they're seeing a reason perhaps for, I suppose, almost a new Iron Curtain going up along the border between, Ukraine, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, whatever, and Russia, beyond which, Putin must be held back. So I suppose, what's happened is Starmer's the first to sort of say it really publicly, but the others do seem to be moving that way.
Yeah, and the point I was going to make is that until now, that's not been the case. But now what we're seeing is, because Trump has been so strident and so isolationist, and Sir John Major raised alarm about that yesterday and talked about it being an increasingly perilous time for the world, not just for America and Europe. Other European leaders are suddenly saying we have to do something. So when I talk about mixed messages, that's pretty much the thrust of my argument, that the objective is peace. But how will it come about? Will it come about through appeasement? Will it be the case that, as Donald Trump appears to want to do, that Putin ends up with this whole thing before negotiations have even started, with the territory that he has basically claimed, and what would be there to stop him doing it elsewhere around Europe as well? And you've got European leaders saying we now have to do something. We cannot now rely at all on Donald Trump to do anything in relation to territory in Europe. So it's the reason why so many of our viewers are concerned, not just in this country, but around Europe.
Yeah. Now, Paul says this orange man said he would end the war in 24 hours. It has taken him a bit longer than that. But, you know, 1 90-minute phone call, it does turn out to be something like that in the end. But they have sort of been dancing around each other for a few months, Putin and Trump, and now they seem to have come to an agreement. So what do you think?
Susie, those you meant, forgive me for interrupting, I do apologize. It's interesting, isn't it? You say Putin and Trump, and you've just thrown up yet another question, because how can Starmer be talking about sending troops to enforce a peace deal that hasn't been thrashed out yet? And Ukraine say that there will be no peace deal that it agrees to unless they are at the table. Now, I said at the start that Marco Rubio's touched down in Riyadh and the Ukrainian delegation has touched down in Riyadh, but no Putin, no Trump. And we know Trump's way of doing things is to pick up the phone and have a conversation with his opposite number. And all of the indications right now suggest that Zelensky will not be part of a conversation to resolve this issue. And the indication, the optics are that all of these individuals making their way to, it's all performative. It's all performative. Yeah. Nothing is going to get done.
Agreed, hasn't it, in that phone call, pretty much. I mean, what do you think, everybody? Do you think that we're looking at proper peace here? Is this something that you are prepared to devote British troops to, so long as, you know, no weapons are fired? Presumably, because we haven't got very many, but we have been training Ukrainian troops during the conflict. Probably what would happen is we'd be sending in officers to, you know, control or command a degree of Ukrainian troops or international troops below. And in terms of protecting some kind of front line. But the problem with Ukraine was always that it was not a NATO country, but it was a buffer between Russia and NATO. It could therefore be invaded if you are Russia, and we could therefore not retaliate if you are NATO, because, you know, I said those are the rules for a nuclear engagement. But once peace breaks out, those NATO troops can be positioned inside that border without that fear of retaliation, right? Because the remit is clearly not to invade Russia, it's to protect Ukraine from Russia. I know you think that Starmer's kind of been a bit, I suppose, lacking in caution here, I think, is what I'm getting from you, which is so unlike Starmer, isn't it? But I'm not quite sure if this isn't just almost a brilliant bit of politics. We finally are getting European troops. Well, you can finally get European troops in there in Ukraine onto an edge without that fear of retaliation from Russia. It makes Starmer look strong on the world stage compared to Trump and his appeasement, right? The Tories can't attack him for it. Boris Johnson has to say, well done, Keir Starmer. The vast majority of the British public don't want the war in Ukraine to continue, and like Leslie, they think peace is a different situation, but they might not support troops going to fight a war, but they would support troops for peace. Does that not actually? It's kind of ticking all the boxes, isn't it? If you're Keir Starmer.
Yes and no. On the other hand, it could well be that Putin and Trump have that relationship where Trump can pick up the phone to him, and it looks as though everything might well be agreed without Starmer having any kind of contribution. So he wants to play catch up, and so he's made this dramatic intervention. I say intervention, it's almost a throw of the dice more than anything else. And it's, again, if we talk about the British public, what the British public don't want is a commitment, a financial commitment elsewhere when there are so many well-documented problems in this country, and B, they don't want our soldiers committed, put it into the way of potentially yet more attacks from the forces of Russia in Ukraine. So I'm not so sure this is going to play out as well as Keir Starmer intends it to. I think there is more concern than optimism around this latest development.
Yes, this is what's happening today, everyone. I don't know how you feel about this, but get into the comments and let us know. So Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, basically Foreign Secretary as far as Americans are concerned, has landed in Saudi Arabia. A Russian delegation has also appeared. There are some Ukrainians there, and that is something that I think Ukrainians were not intended to go originally, but there were so many international statesmen, including Starmer, who said you've got to have the Ukrainians involved. And of course, Zelensky said that. They did end up getting the invite in the end. Steve says there cannot be peace unless both Russia and Ukraine agree. Zelensky has to be involved in peace talks. And what these sort of lower down middle managers are going to agree or talk about or decide, firstly, it's probably already been decided by Trump and Putin, I would guess. Secondly, the Ukrainians going to be told to lump it. And then if it works and if they can get an agreement, then you get to the point where you have Trump and Putin and Zelensky at some kind of summit and everyone looking marvelous and happy and shaking hands. Now, so they're all inside doing this, but it is literally really, it is the world's superpower, economic superpower, and a former superpower pretty much agreeing how to carve up a third country, isn't it? And then imposing that upon those people by saying, well, if you don't do this, you're going to continue this horrible war, which you are losing very slowly. And forgive me if I've got this wrong, Darren, but is that not exactly what the colonial powers did in the 19th and previous centuries? Is it not also undemocratic in the extreme from America, which claims to be the world's greatest democracy?
Listen, you as ever, Susie, you're bang on, and you know, we've seen this side of Trump before. Property developer Trump, who wants to turn Gaza into the Riviera of the Middle East. He has designs on territory that just go beyond. I'm trying to be diplomatic. I'm on a live broadcast on the Mirror platform here. If we were having dinner somewhere, I'll probably be a bit more.
You might use a few slides.
Listen, I just think that Zelensky is suddenly, he's become very wise to what he thinks Trump's intentions are, but he's been very diplomatic, save for the fact that he said, listen, I'm not agreeing to any peace deal, any ceasefire, anything, if I'm not at the table. The problem, and he is in the Middle East, even though Trump was sort of saying that there are going to be talks and he's going to be invited and whatever else. He is clearly not party to the conversations that Trump is having with Putin. And I think Trump's designs and Trump's end game for this is very different to Zelensky's end game for all this, given that Trump is on record as saying on a number of occasions he believes too much American money has been committed to the war in Ukraine. And just one note on Putin as well. Just one note very quickly on Putin as well, because even if there was something agreed, remember, Putin promised not to invade Ukraine in the first place, and he did. He is a man that has been shown you trust him at your peril, shall we say.
Yeah, and it literally is the deal with the devil. Ian Toe, I think that's his name, says Putin's a liar. He said he wouldn't invade in the first place. Exactly your point, Darren. And we've also got situations where, you know, other countries have joined NATO since the start of the war. Finland, Sweden, and there are 3 countries on the northern edge of Europe: Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which are not only right up abutting Russia, but our former Soviet republics, which he would very much want to rejoin. And they sit between him and one little outpost called Kaliningrad of the old Soviet Empire, which he is now, it's an energy island. It has to be self-sufficient. It's energy.
Fun fact, Susie, I've been to Kaliningrad. And you're right. It is, it's very oldie worldy type place. But
I suspect it's Russia's next excuse for saying, well, our people over there are in danger from something I've just imagined, so I need to establish a little corridor, you know. And the Estonian troops, there's not an awful lot of them. And what's the next step? Because then you are going into NATO countries, and then you are going into EU countries as well, and it's a big issue. Leslie says, what's in the Ukraine that Trump and Putin want? It's not just the sunflowers, Leslie. There's lots of rare minerals. Trump has said, you know, he will help out as long as he can get his hands on some of the goods. It's as simple as that. But what Putin really wants is to re-establish the old Russia of the Tsars and on the old borders, which is get back everything that fell apart after the Soviet Union.
That's how oligarchy works.
Which is where we're heading to. Whereas Trump just wants to get a Nobel Peace Prize, pretend that he's ended a war, which, All right, mate. But anyway, we'll have to see how that pans out. I think Starmer's done quite a good thing here. I think this is going to work for him. Darren disagrees, but we'll have to see how it pans out in the long run, won't we? I suspect Boris Johnson's sitting at home over his Daily Mail column, going, "Oh, what do I say?" Doesn't know what to do. Now, on to the big story of the day, which is, as you already mentioned, Health Secretary Wes Streeting's announcement that he has not only hit but surpassed his target of £2 million extra NHS appointments to help clear the backlog that was built up after COVID and years of repeated cutbacks. Now, Darren, can you explain this to us? How has he done it?
Lizzie
It's February, so it's last July. It's what, 8-9 months he's managed to.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny actually because he'd been intending to actually shout about this, and then obviously everyone started asking about Trump. But listen, he's delivered. Got to be fair to him, he's delivered millions of extra appointments. And I want to say he claims he's done it, but the NHS England figures that are out today actually do show that between July and November 2024, there were almost 2.2 million more appointments than they were in the same period of the previous year, 2023. 7 months earlier, they've done it than the target date. They've done it by ramping up weekend and evening working. They've done it with more than 100,000 extra treatments, tests and scans each week. Now, listen, I personally, I wouldn't go breaking out the bunting just yet. I'm sounding like a real cynic here, but it's our job to be cynics. We're not cheerleaders. You know, we are here.
We're not cynics, realists. Realists.
Well, indeed. And so many of the people watching this and reading our platforms, their experience isn't one to shout out about. And certainly my wife, listen, she was in an A&E, not a month ago, for something she believed would take around about 3 hours. She turned up there at 6 p.m. on a Saturday evening. She was back at 5 a.m. on the Sunday morning. So let's not kid ourselves. A lot of people's experience on a day-to-day basis is horrendous. We hear about blood blocking, crisis with staffing, people waiting ages even to get an appointment, doctors' appointments just like gold dust at the moment. So there is a kind of a feeling that Wes Streeting isn't quite reading the room with a tone that some people see as self-congratulatory. And it's been quite striking, actually, to see him on the breakfast TV shows this morning saying, "I'm not doing victory laps just yet," when actually doing the rounds of the various forms of previous broadcast media and TV, he's doing just that.
Yeah.
But listen, I'm going to give him the credit where it's due. The Conservatives left 7.6 million pounds, 7.6 million on waiting lists. And he's come in, the Labour have come in, he's been in charge of the health service, and he has done what he promised he would do. How you asked me how he'd done it, I've gone all around the houses, but I'll just say that he says they've done it by making unpopular decisions. They've allocated big money, a pot of money, to the trusts with the biggest waiting lists, and allowed for more funding, and it's worked. The numbers have come down. The backlog in December fell for the fourth consecutive month to 7.46, I think it was, treatments. So they've done a good job, and we've got to congratulate them. But there is a long, long way to go.
Yeah. Now, what do you think, everybody? What's your experience of the NHS been in the past, 8 months or so since Labour came to power? Has it improved? Is it any better? What is your experience of things? So this cut in waiting list, have you noticed more weekend or evening appointments, especially in hospitals? Richard says, if the NHS is on the road to better health, then Starmer will get his second term, unless perhaps we're in a recession and have some complication in Ukraine for them to end up being saddled with. Now, I too was in a hospital at the weekend. I had a scan. One of these things that Wes Streeting is talking about, right? I had a scan in an MRI, great big multi-million scanner on Saturday afternoon. But there are a couple of things that I noticed about this. First off, when the request for the scan went through, I got it very, very quickly. but the scan was actually requested about 3 times and it never went through. And I had to keep chasing it up and nagging the GP and then nagging the hospital and getting them to email the GP and getting the GP to email them back. And, if I wasn't a journalist and absolutely determined to defeat institutions of every sort, I probably wouldn't have. I'd be sitting here waiting for my appointment for the scan still. As it is, we got the appointment through then quite quickly. And it was a Saturday. Now, when I walked into the hospital, they have these sort of, self-sign-in computer monitors to save receptionist time and effort and everything else and tell you you're going to Orange Zone C over here or wherever it is. And there's a big sign on them saying, not in work at the weekends. They were on. They were switched on. But a little sign going, don't use these at the weekend. Why? Why not? So I went into the scan room. There wasn't a receptionist on reception. The nurse was doing the job of the receptionist. And then she signed me in, got the forms done, then took me around the back and got a cannula in my arm. So she was doing that because she's a trained nurse. So no receptionist around because it's the weekend and that would involve paying them extra money. But she wasn't a local NHS nurse. She was agency staff. She was wearing the agency fleece. So it cost more to employ her, although she was doing 2 jobs. But the private shareholders are taking the money out of that. She's not getting the whatever, £2,000 a shift. There were then more staff than there were patients. The patients, there's like one every half hour, another one came in, steady, but not a busy department. And I felt like a bit of a fraud because I'd got a fairly minor thing I was having checked out. And the person before me in the scanner was like about an 18-month-old baby that was clearly very seriously ill. And you feel like, oh God, why am I taking up an MRI scanner when other people could be helped with this? Steve says, having spent all day in A&E with my elderly uncle a couple of weeks ago, I'm not convinced that everything is fixed just yet. Your wife's problem was A&E as well. I mean, I was an outpatient appointment, Darren, but that A&E part of the hospital is 24 hours. It's obviously worse on Saturday nights. And other things. But the other bits of the hospital, they're not running 7 days a week. They're not even turning the sign-in machines on. It's just, it needs to be 7-day service right across the board.
Absolutely.
But it's overtime, isn't it? Getting that scanner working for me on Saturday and for the other people that were using it involved agency staff and loads of overtime. How is that a good use? Spending so much more money on that doesn't make much sense.
Absolutely. And I think it's the reason why so many people, a lot of the news agenda, Susie, as you know, is interconnected. People see money being used for things about which the government pat themselves on the back and turn around and say, hang on a minute, our day-to-day experience isn't such that you have any right to do that. You've just mentioned a couple of your experiences. I'll tell you one involving my next door neighbor. I was working at home. I could hear from the garden her calling out. She would be in her early 60s. To cut a long story short, she'd fallen and broken her hip. So I went out there and I was sitting with her. She was lying on the cold concrete. I tried to lift her to get her into a house. I couldn't. I called 999. I was told that I'd have to wait. Eventually, my wife came home, sat with her, covered her with a blanket on the cold concrete. I'm having a stand-up row with the caller, which, to be fair, it's not the caller's fault at all that the service is in disarray. But what happened was we ended up waiting for 7 hours with this poor woman on the cold concrete for an ambulance to arrive. And that story isn't even typical of our average viewer, because so many people have waited 10, 11, 12, 14 hours. But my heart went out to this lady who literally was in agony on cold concrete. It started to rain a little bit. We had an umbrella over her too. We got her to hospital eventually. It was dark, it was cold. And when I hear politicians crowing and pretending they're not crowing about small steps to get to where we are, it really boils my blood. I wrote about it in my column about the experience that this lady went through, because I think so many people's experience is exactly that. And until that sort of thing improves, the government would be really, really wise and savvy to keep their own counsel until they get to a point where that kind of thing becomes a thing of the past.
Yeah, I suspect it's because there's not very much good news, and they've got some. They've got to go and make the most of it. It has to go out on the media grids for this week before Donald Trump says something that completely screws up the messaging for the rest of the week. Leslie says, A&E average 20-hour wait with my 94-year-old mum, and then discharged because there were no beds available. I put it down to a lack of GP appointments, and why did they close all the minor injury units around here? It's just crazy.
It's crazy.
What do you agree?
I remember once, forgive me, Susie, I keep interrupting you. I apologize. I remember you talk about staff doing jobs that other people should be doing. I remember sitting in a doctor's surgery not so long ago near where I live, and a lady had come in, and she was trying to book an appointment, and the receptionist was asking her what the issue was. Now, the lady said, well, with respect to you, I'd rather tell the doctor. And she says, no, you've got to tell me first, and then I can assess whether the doctor should see you as a priority or not. And so this woman had to, and she was clearly mortified at having to do that, but she started to explain what the issue was. Now, for me, that's unacceptable, but that's the kind of thing that is happening in our health service right now, day to day. Some people might see it as trivia. Other people might see it as the kind of thing that they just don't want to have to go through. And it is for that reason why we have to keep encouraging people to go, because a lot of people don't go. And on the front page, we're encouraging people. Victoria Derbyshire's done a fantastic job. And who else was it? Who was Julia Bradbury, encouraging people to go and get screenings, to go and get those checks on their health that will save their lives. But part of the problem is people's experience with the health service is horrendous. And I haven't even got to the CAM system for people with mental health and neurodivergent issues. It is a nightmare. And so until we can sort that out, we cannot politicians cannot pat themselves on the back. They've got to recognize what ordinary people are going through.
Yeah, and there's more stuff to be done. So now there's still more than 6 million people on waiting lists, down from more than 7 million, like Darren said, when Labour took over. There's about 7.4 million treatments that are needed for those 6 million or so. Wes Streeting's doing the rounds this morning, crowing about this success, but saying he's not crowing about it while crowing. What does me a bit, Darren, is about how this is being paid for. You've got agency staff, you've got overtime contracts and so on. That's the sort of thing that has sucked resource out of the NHS for years. It's enabled politicians to say, oh, we've increased spending. We're spending more than ever before. But actually, we're getting less in return. And that's how that dichotomy has come about, because they're spending more on this weekend stuff and more on getting private healthcare in to do things. And actually, it's just a sticking plaster, and it's a sticking plaster that's made of gold, and it's costing us more money. So, I mean, the big question really is, what's Labour going to do next? How are we going to actually manage to repair the NHS? Because Labour's announced a pot of money for repairs and capital projects, which will be given to the trusts that cut waiting lists the most. So in the one hand, well, that's a great incentive because you get a new ward or something if you do really well. But on the other hand, isn't that just going to encourage them to bump patients off the list, to rush them, to drop names down the toilet or whatever, spend too much on agency staff maybe by dangling this carrot in front of them? One of the things Wes Streeting's been talking about is localising more care, getting it back in the community. But he's also talking about saying lots of specialist hubs. So if you've got cancer, you've got to go further to get treated. They're talking about having an app where you can choose and pick and select where you get treated for things. But if you can travel, that's fine. You can go to the other hospital. But if you are poorer, if you're relying on the bus, if you are really ill, if you're more disabled, you can't do any of that stuff. And you've got to go further for the treatment that was a bit closer because someone's closed the minor injury unit, because someone's closed the local cancer ward, and now it's, 2 towns across. How do we fix it? And get it done, as Richard said, in time for the next election, because the NHS is always like a crucial deciding factor, isn't it, in our elections? And regardless of what else is going on, if you had, say, Reform being quite insurgent in the next election, they were always talking about privatising the NHS. They were always talking about selling it off. And they're never going to say, let's put more money into it. If you had a repaired or at least better functioning NHS against that, I mean, Starmer would walk it, you'd have thought. They've got to get that done. How are they going to do it, Darren?
The honest answer is I'm not sure, but I think if they can continue with this commitment to giving money to the areas where the waiting lists are highest and the waiting times are highest, then they've got a chance. I know the latest figures show that 73% percent of patients were treated or assessed within 4 hours in A&E. But again, and I keep having to recognize that the as you rightly say, we have to be fair to them. Their messaging, they want to get a lot of this out before it's wiped out by the news agenda. We beat politicians with a stick enough. So sometimes when they do things well, it is important to recognize that. But as I say, you have to set that against what people's real time experience is. And the only way to sort that out is by allocating the money to bring in the staff, to make sure that staff aren't having to do 2 jobs instead of 1, to make sure staff are available at the weekend, and those machines you talk about sitting there catching dust when they could be utilized in order to further bring down waiting lists are operational. There are very obvious things that they can do. I started off by saying I don't know, but actually I do.
Yeah, well, I think as well, you've got to have something, you do something radical. There's an awful lot of tiny little bits of nibbling around the edges going on here. You know, we need to do this, we need to spend some money there, get the waiting down. The one thing that would really solve a lot of problems with the NHS would be a national care service. And it's something that would end that bed blocking. It would be huge economies of scale for purchase of medicines and things like that. It would bring costs down, and everyone would support it. It could be in place and running by the next election. And they don't seem to be using their political capital that they got from that big electoral win to do something radical. And I think that's what we need to do. But me and Anti Burnham appear to be the only people who think that. So we'll have to see how it all works out, won't we? Right. Thank you for that, Darren. Thank you for taking us through some of that. Now, we have managed to find some good news in the world for you. And here it is. Now, here's a story to warm your heart. The village high street that is holding out against the mini Sainsbury's and Tesco metros, charging you a fortune for your staple goods. Daphne Creed is the 3rd generation of her family, after her mother and grandmother, to run the same village shop in Somerset, in the same building as well. And she's talking in the paper about the amazing support she gets from the community and what they get in return. They have about 60 customers a day. Obviously, it's still really healthy, going strong, which is amazing to hear about. Hopefully it'll be passed on to her children when the time comes. Darren, is this proof that there's nothing quite as healthy for all of us as buying local?
Absolutely, yes. I'm a big supporter of my local economy, although it hasn't been thriving for as long as this one. I'm going to take you very briefly through the story, if I can, Susie, because Adam Aspinall's done it for us, and he's been talking to Daphne and her family. They've been running the same village shop since 1890, so they've seen 135 years. I'm just doing my math there, of upheaval on the high street. She's 77. She's in Mandeville in Somerset. She's a 3rd generation to look after the store. She took over from her mum Phyllis in 1991. Phyllis ran it for 55 years after she took it over from her mum Susan, who took over the reins 45 years earlier. I hope you're following this.
Just
but it's a wonderful story of community at a time when we're becoming more and more disconnected as a society. But also, as you started off by saying, the big high street stores come along. They've done it in 1 or 2 areas near where I live, and they hoover up all of the custom, because a lot of people find them convenient, in some cases cheaper, but there are still areas of the country where people prefer to shop locally. There's a wonderful couple of little nuggets in this story as well, if I can, because it really did make me smile. We don't just sell these pieces. One of them is where Daphne says the best part of her job is meeting the customers who have become her friends, and they would, wouldn't they? But the other thing that really did make me smile was where she said that her mum had struggled with decimalization, and she didn't think that she'd be able to cope long term, but ultimately she did just fine. And it reminded me of a story of a woman who was, I think she was 105, and She was asked about her recollections of her life, and she said, "I remember when Vincent van Gogh cut off his ear. There was a terrible fuss."
The things we can recall from our misspent youth. I can remember being stuck in an earthquake and drinking so much whiskey I didn't notice. That's life on the road.
That's a completely different show.
Completely different show. We'd have to do something entirely different. I don't know what we call that one. Right. Thank you, Darren, for taking us through all that. Thank you, everyone, for taking part. We'll wait and see how things pan out, won't we? But we will be back with another edition of a News Agenda on Wednesday. And this week it's a special three-way with Chris Buckton, our US editor, and Chris Hughes, our defense editor. We're going to be talking about Ukraine and Trump in detail. Some good expert in-depth analysis. So make sure you're here for that on Wednesday at our usual time of 9 o'clock or a bit late, because I'm always a bit late. Right. Thank you, Darren, for that. Thank you, everyone else. We will see you again on Wednesday. Until then, everybody, stay safe. Take care. Tatty bye.